Supply and demand curves, types of goods, and barriers to entry. So let's look at the microeconomic environment section of the syllabus. So in this element, learners need to understand the concept of supply and demand. So we can go through that. How prices are determined by price mechanisms. So this is supply and demand curves, really, and how we they shift according to market forces, and the impacts of goods, the type of goods that we have, normal necessities, substitute and complementary, on those supply and demand curves and how they shift. The impact of price changes on volumes, revenues, costs, and profitability. So we'll see how those supply and demand curves move around, and then we'll see the impact of competition as well. So the competition, how that's going to influence the number of suppliers, and the number of buyers, and therefore the price and decision making that goes on. Barriers to entry, which will be about the creation of trying to create monopolies if we can. Barriers to entry. Potentially barriers to exit as well, and location, which will be a barrier to a method of trying to create a barrier to entry. Availability of information as market types in terms of knowledge. So that's the syllabus here. So what's the best way to learn this? So what we're going to do is we're going to go through in the order of which we're going to learn it. I'll do the types of goods first and separately. Then I'm going to do the supply and demand curves next and separately, and then I'm going to tie them together. Often they're trying to be taught together, really, in terms of the supply and demand goods for normal goods or what have you, and the supply and demand goods for inferior goods. But I think you need to separate them first before you can then tie them together, otherwise it's just too much to take in. So we'll separate those out first, and then we'll tie it together. Then we'll look at how we use supply and demand curves for price and profit maximisation. We'll look at the types of competition, and then again we'll tie them together with our supply and demand curves. And then we'll look at the creation of barriers to entry, how we use barriers to entry to create monopoly positions. And that's really our plan. So that's what we're going to do in terms of our approach. Hope you enjoy this. You'll need to go all the way to the end, I suppose, really to get the real full value out of this one, because of the way in which we're going to order it. But I think you'll really struggle otherwise to get the concepts if you don't have it in this order. If you could please leave a like or a comment, that'd be much appreciated. So, types of goods. So normal goods and inferior goods. So we'll separate into three different types. So normal goods and inferior goods. So a normal good, as income increases, so as the economy increases, so there's lower employment, people got more money, or as your personal income increases, you demand more of this good, so you want more. So instead of having one laptop, you have two laptops, or a faster laptop, bigger laptop, whatever. So as income increases, you demand more of it. Typically most of the goods in the world, and that's why they're called normal goods. Your income increases, you want more. And inferior goods the other way around now. As your income increases, you demand less of it. So the traditional one is cars versus cycles. You start off and your income's really low, and so you buy yourself a cycle and you ride that around. Your income then increases, you're doing well, and you think, well, I'd like a car, please. So you buy a car. Then you bought a budget car, and say now your income increases really, even more, and you think, well, actually I'll move from this budget car to this high-end car. So what you've got then here is this sort of movement of, as income increases, as the economy increases, if you've got an inferior good, the demand for your good can go down. So that's so we've got normal goods really here, and so you often see a question saying it's a normal good, and that's sort of telling you as income increases, your demand's going to go up. And an inferior good, which we've seen, that'd be a bit of a difficult question if somebody decided to set that. But an inferior good would be as income increases, demand would go down. So let's say we got in a tourism tourist company, and their normal goods would be just our normal sort of nice package holidays, let's say 3 or 4 star sort of hotels and what have you, and but our inferior goods would be our budget end, the sort of the camping sort of side, or maybe 1 star sort of hotels and whatever. And as if income went up, then there'd be no more demand for this sort of low end product. So normal goods and inferior goods. Substitute and complementary goods. So substitute goods are, so this is about other suppliers and what they've got and what they're supplying, really. So a substitute good is a good that can be substituted for our product. So it's it can be really strong substitutes, so just a straight up like swap, or it could be a weak substitute. Well, let's say how we get a strong substitute: Coke versus Pepsi, dark drink that's fizzy, got caffeine in, a bit sugary. So Coke versus Pepsi. if Pepsi increased the price of their good, so people stopped buying as much Pepsi as they would have to, they'd switch to our Coke. So the price increases of Pepsi, demand for Coke increases. Similarly, the flip side though, Pepsi decided to have a price war, so they reduced the price of their Pepsi by a lot. Then people sort of switched from Coke to Pepsi because it's cheaper. So you've got this sort of idea of substitute goods. How much does these other goods compete against our good? How much can they be substituted? We have complementary goods though, and complementary goods are linked, and they're not really much good without much use without each other. So let's say we got the tires and cars would be a good one. Neither are really that much use without the other. So let's say that there's a shortage of rubber in the world, and so the price of tires goes up. And that increase in the price of tires would reduce the demand for cars, because there's less money left over for the car, and so it's only a slight sort of shift. But if it's the flip side, and there's a big reduction in the amount of cars, because let's say there's a semiconductor shortage after COVID and sort of the war in Ukraine, then there's a reduction in the number of demand for tires because there's less cars. So if the price of the complementary good increases, then it reduces the demand for our good. So instead of the opposite of the substitute good, where the price was increasing and therefore our demand increased, in a complementary good, if the price is increasing, the demand for our product reduces. And similarly vice versa. So those are substitute and complementary goods. And then we've got necessities and Giffen goods or luxury goods, really. So necessities are that you have to have it, really, here. So we'll see the demand curve for a necessity shortly. So you have to have it, really, and the price is very much dependent on scarcity and the supply. So if you think about the thing that you need to have more than anything in the world right now is that you need to have air. You're sucking that into your lungs in there, and if that was scarce, so that you couldn't, you were sort of switched off, you'd pay anything for that air. But the fact that it's not scarce means that you're not paying it. So you do need to have scarcity to be able to have a price as well. So necessity, you've got to have it. So things that sort of sit in this world in here are things like cigarettes for people who are addicted to smoking, or alcohol. Food would be sitting in necessities, and those kind of things, really, necessity goods. And then we have this sort of other sort of section of goods, which are luxury Giffen goods. And what happens here in these luxury goods is that they set a high price, and the high price by itself sets the demand. So a Rolex is really expensive, and therefore people want it. If the price of the Rolex was dropped so that it was really cheap, people wouldn't want it anymore. And so you can have this sort of thing where you can actually reduce the price and reduce the demand, or alternatively increase the price and increase the demand. So handbags would be a good one on this one. Right, so those are our types of goods. Let's put those to one side now, and let's do demand curves and supply curves. So what is a demand curve? Well, it's basically a graph. So we've got on the y-axis we've got price, and on the x-axis we've got quantity. And so the demand curve, although it's always drawn as a straight line, is how the quantity of demand increases as we reduce our price. So let's say we start up here, and this is Mars bars, and I want to sell one Mars bar. And I really like Mars. I don't actually really like Mars bars, but let's assume that I do. So I really like this Mars bar, and I'm prepared to pay a high price. Now somebody comes along and says, well, there's two elements here. Firstly, let's consider the one person. Well, would you like to have a second Mars bar? And I go, well, go on, and I'll have this second Mars bar, but of course it wasn't as nice as the first Mars bar, so I'm getting a bit, so I'm prepared to pay less for two Mars bars per Mars bar, so the price has to be reduced to get me to buy two of them. And he goes, well, would you like to have three of them? And I go, well, I'm getting a bit sickly, but go on, I'll have this third one in there, so I'm prepared to have. So you have to drop the price even further to get me to buy this third Mars bar, and then this fourth Mars bar, and eventually down here I'm totally sick of Mars bars, and it doesn't matter how much you drop the price, and I'm not buying any more Mars bars. That's one set of people for the individual. The other sort of set as well is that people are different as well. So I might really like Mars bars, you might really not like Mars bars. You have to have a lower price for the Mars bar for you to buy it, and the thing is, though, is that if the price is the price that's offered to the lowest person, the lowest price that's offered, that everybody gets. So, to get three people to buy it, let's say in here, we have to offer this, sell it at this price to get 1, 2, 3 people to buy. So that's our our demand curve the relationship between price and the quantity that will be demanded at that price. Typically downward sloping. So we can move up and down the demand curve based on the amount that we want to sell. Now we can move our demand curves can shift, so they can shift to the right and to the left, and so they're shifting to the right and the left based upon the demand and the economy. So let's you got this sort of social changes, haven't you? And you got the economic changes in your pestle analysis in here. So we got this sort of shift to the right. And the shift to the right is we got more. So for the same price, there's more demanded. That's a shift to the right in the demand curve. For the same price, more is demanded, and a shift to the left for the same price, less is demanded. So shift to the right, shift to the left in our demand curves. This here is an inelastic demand side. So really in terms of it's sort of getting to a necessity. If it was absolutely perfect, we'd have to have it, then it would be a straight line down. But this is a necessity, and what we're going to basically do is we have to have a certain amount of it, or we're just going to have none of it. And so this is a very steep demand curve. It's an elastic one, and then if it's a very flat demand curve, so price, the amount that we demand is very much dependent upon the amount of the price that we charge, and then it's elastic. So inelastic, the amount of demand is not really dependent that much upon price. We've got to have it. So let's say for cigarette smokers, then the prices of cigarettes, the smokers have to have it, and there's the inelastic demand. They'll pay whatever needs to be paid, and then until a point where it just gets too much and they just quit. And elastic demand would be something where the price is very much determined on what we're going to do, the quantity we're going to actually sort of demand. So supply curves. So a supply curve is sort of saying how much is it costing, how much is our cost to produce that quantity, and therefore what the price is. So our supply curve is assumed to go upwards. It might, in some instances, go as a bit of a curve like that and then tick upwards like this one. But the assumption that the supply curve is upwards, is an upward sloping demand, is because the idea that at the start down here, the raw materials are cheaper. But then as we start to demand more and more of these raw materials, they're harder to extract. Or alternatively, our sort of staff members, down here we're getting the better staff members here, and as we demand more and more of them, we have the staff members aren't as good, and also we have to start paying more because of the supply and demand of labour. So this idea that prices sort of it becomes harder and harder to demand. And we can have, in reality, we can have sort of reductions and increases in terms of economies of scale and what have you there, but that's the general typical way the supply curve is drawn, as an upward sloping supply curve. And we move up and down. So if we wanted to supply this amount here, it would cost us this amount. So that's the idea. So as we move to the right and we supply more of them, it's going to cost us more. Okay, so we've got price and quantity on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis for both our supply and demand curves, and this idea of downward sloping demand curves and upward sloping supply curves. And as with the demand curve, we can shift upwards. So we can have a shifting upwards. So for the same quantity, it's costing us more. So here is a sort of a parallel movement. So this will be a shift in fixed costs. If it was an increase in variable costs, let's say, we might be having more of a different gradient and what have you in there. So we've got these sort of shifts in our supply and demand curves. So we would you typically just write them all out if there was a requirement to. So we got our supply curves, and they might shift up and down. Our demand curve shifting left and right. And so now what we're going to see then is in terms of, now we've got those two, our supply and demand curves, we're now going to move on to our goods really. So the demand curve for a normal good. Yeah, so you might have a question and it'll say that this is a normal good and there's been something that happens that shifts the demand. So let's say an increase in the income or whatever for a normal good in the economy, and it's a normal good. Well, in a normal good then, an increase in income that we would have shifts the demand curve to the right. We've got more money, the economy is doing better, people have got more money, there'll be an increase in demand. If there's a reduction in the economy and a reduction in the amount of money that people have, there'll be a reduction in demand. So that would be how a demand curve will shift for a normal good. For an inferior good, it's the other way around. As the economy increases, then our demand is reduced. So as the economy increases, the demand for our cycles, whatever, is reducing here, and as the economy worsens, then increases. People sort of switch to our product for say budget cars or what have you, then the demand increases. So that's the demand curve shifts for our inferior good. In terms of the demand curve shifts for a substitute good, and let's say the substitute good has increased in price. So as the substitute good increases in price, people shift from their good to our good. The demand for our good increases. So for the same price, the quantity demanded would increase as people switch from the substitute good to our good. And if the substitute good decides to reduce its price and enter into, let's say, a bit of a price war with us, then for the same price, the quantity demanded of our product will reduce as well. So there'll be a shift to the left in the demand curve. And in terms of a complementary good, if the complementary good reduces its price, so the complementary good has reduced its price in there, then there'll be greater demand for that complementary good. They need our good to go alongside it, so there's more cars and therefore they need more tyres. So the demand at the same price for our tyres has increased. So our demand curve shifts to the right if the complementary good reduces its price. And if the complementary good increases its price, so a semiconductor shortage increases the amount of increases the price of cars and reduces the demand for cars, then our good is going to shift to the left. Our demand curve is going to shift to the left as there's less demand for tyres. So there's our complementary goods. Now then, so we've got that, and we've tied together now our demand curves for the different types of demand curves and supply curves for different types of goods. And now we're going to look separately at price and profit maximization here. So we've got different types of markets, and let's start with a normal market, a normal sort of perfect market, really. Here, what's sort of described as many suppliers, many buyers. And so if you see a many suppliers, many buyers description, what that means is that there's no individual supplier who can sort of manipulate the amount of quantity sold into the market and restrict it and therefore push up the price. So in this instance, if there's many suppliers in there, then what I'm going to do is this supplier, if I decide to restrict the amount that I sell, somebody else simply comes in and they sell it instead. This would be the same in terms of substitute goods as well. I decide to restrict the price of the quantity of my good to try and push up the price. Somebody comes in with their substitute good, and they just, and people just swap and buy that instead if there's a strong substitute. So in this world here of many suppliers or substitute goods in there, I cannot decide to say, well, instead of selling this amount here, this quantity here, I can sell this amount here. I can't manipulate the amount of quantity. I can't restrict supply into the market. What does that do? Well, in the world of many suppliers and many buyers, so let's say we start in here and the price is here. Okay, well, there's this cost of supply, and so you can see there's profit being made here, more than what's known as normal profit. So what's known as super normal profit here that's being made. So another supplier comes in and they decide, well, actually, I'll offer it at a cheaper price. And I'll offer this additional one at a cheaper price. It pushes the price down. And then the supplier comes in and they offer it more and they push the price down until we get to this point where supply is demand. So in a normal market, many buyers, many suppliers, sort of a perfect competition, often described as perfect competition as well. The price is set where supply is equal to demand. The cost of supply is equal to the demand at the price at that's set at that quantity from the demand curve, and supply is equal to demand. So many buyers, many suppliers. So, the price is set and the quantity is set where the supply and demand curve intersect, and supply is equal to demand. Price would be here, quantity would be here. But let's say that that's not the situation. Let's say we're in a situation where it's a monopoly, and you go, well actually, in here, all I'm doing is I'm covering my costs. Can I do any better as a supplier? So let's say we're now into a monopoly situation in here. Now let's look at these demand curves. In here, as we were reducing and we wanted to increase the quantity, we had to reduce the price, not just for the person that we wanted to encourage to buy our product, but for all the previous people that we wanted to sell to as well. So the first person here was prepared to pay a high price up here for just their one. They had real high demand in there. They were prepared to pay up here, but this next person was prepared to pay down here, and so this person paid at this price, but also this person who was prepared to pay more paid at that lower price, and they kept paying lower prices until we got to here. And so all these people here who were prepared to pay a higher price didn't pay it. They paid this lower price. So the actual marginal revenue of increasing this quantity was a much steeper line, because not only were we having to charge the lower price for the person that we wanted to encourage to buy the additional quantity, but we had to offer that lower price to everybody else. And so the marginal revenue line is actually twice as steep as the demand curve. In terms of our supply, as we were going along, we were having to increase this quantity in here. We were having our cost of supply was increasing, wasn't it? Not only did we have to pay this higher wage to this person that we wanted to encourage to join the workforce, but all the previous workers that we employed, we had to match their wages, because they're all going, well, why would we take home any lower pay than somebody else? We'll just move to some other supplier. So we had to increase the supply of all of our labourers as we were going along, or increase the price that we were paying them. So we got a steeper marginal supply curve. So as our supply curve is increasing, or our supply curve is going an upward sloping supply curve, the marginal cost of supply is even steeper. And the reason for that is, you go along and you want to hire another worker, and so you go into the marketplace and you've got to pay more for that person. All the existing workers that are working for you, they all want that higher wage as well. So the point where you make most profit is where the marginal cost of supply is the same as the marginal revenue. If I was to supply more than that amount, the marginal cost of supply is higher than the additional money that I got for that additional unit. So why would I do that? I'm making losses here. I'm making less profit here than if I just sold it here. So if I'm here where I sold, this is the maximum point of profit here. So along here, should I do another one? Well, yes, the additional marginal income that I get is more than the marginal cost, the additional cost of that one. Yeah, okay. Should I do another more? Well, yes, the additional income that I got, even though I was having to reduce the price for all the previous people, that's still more than the marginal cost. Do I keep going to here? Yes. Here, this is the point with maximisation. Now here, well, if I add additional one and sell additional one here, so I reduce my price to sell one more. I've reduced my price for this person I wanted to sell to, but also all these previous people as well. These people, so that my marginal revenue was lower, and the actual additional cost, the additional labour that I had to go along, plus all the additional amount that I had to pay for all my existing staff members, was higher. So the marginal cost of the supply is higher than the marginal revenue, so I don't supply there. So in a position where I can manipulate and restrict the quantity that's going to be supplied into the market, then I will restrict it to the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, where that marginal supply curve is equal to the marginal revenue curve here. Often seen as MC is equal to MR on this. In that instance, then, what I do is I set this and I restrict the quantity in this point here to this one here. In terms of the demand curve, what people are prepared to pay for that, they're prepared to pay that price here, and I make, in terms of the difference between the cost here, I make this rectangle, this whole rectangle here, of supernormal profit. Now, so if I can restrict the quantity, and I'm in a monopoly position, or short-term in a monopolistic position, then I'm going to restrict the quantity so that I can get the most profit there. So now, really, the ability for me to be able to restrict this quantity back from here, the normal position, and what's known as normal profit, where supply is equal to demand, back to this supernormal profit, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, is dependent upon the market that I'm in. So we've got this types of competition in here. So in a monopoly, I control the supply. So there's no other market or no other set of suppliers of this particular product. But I need to have a second thing as well. I also as well need to be in a situation where there aren't substitute goods as well. So in this monopoly, there aren't substitute goods, and there's no other suppliers, and I can control the supply, and I can maximise my profit really. Or there's weak substitute goods. So in this monopoly, I am Rolex, and I can control the supply of my watches to be able to maximise the price. There's no other person that can come along and supply Rolex watches. In a monopolistic world in here, what this is, there are many suppliers, but there is differentiation in the short term. So in the short term, I can sort of differentiate. There's different types of products, whatever, and therefore I have a short-term monopoly. But over the long term, there isn't that there are weak, what's known as weak barriers to entry. I can't sort of maintain this monopoly over the long term. So short term, there's a monopoly. Long term, there's no monopoly. So short term I can do marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Long term I'm going to earn normal profit. And in a perfect market, many suppliers and many buyers, I cannot restrict the supply. If I restrict the supply, all that happens is another supplier comes along and they offer instead of me, so only normal profit is earned there where supply is equal to demand. So let's go back to our supply. So here, perfect market, many buyers, many suppliers. The price is where supply is equal to demand. Here, short-term monopolistic. So I don't think you'll be getting a question on monopolistic markets, but short-term monopolistic is that the sort of supply is equal to the demand. Marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Long-term, what happens in a monopolistic market is that suppliers see this supernormal profit being earned. They enter the market. Because they enter the market, the demand curve, there's now these sort of substitute goods available to it. The demand curve shifts to the left, and so our demand curve would shift to the left in here, and would eventually end up at that point there. That sort of sets the new price, and then so demand curve shifts there where supply is equal to demand at that particular price there. Yeah. And so we end up with a situation where supply is equal to demand in a monopolistic market. So long-term monopolistic market, demand curve shifts to the left as these other suppliers shift in there, and we get back to the situation where supply is equal to demand. In terms of a monopoly, we can control the quantity, so we can restrict the quantity in there, and we set the price where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. This much higher price, and make that supernormal profit. Well, that's all very interesting, because obviously as a supplier we always want to be in a monopolistic position. Why would we not? We make more profit there. It's brilliant. But the government and regulators wouldn't like that, because clearly that means higher prices for consumers, and this sort of restriction in supply into the market where otherwise we could lower people employed and what have you. So from a supplier point of view, we want to try and create a monopoly. From a sort of government point of view, we might not want to have these monopolies in place. So how do we create one? So in order to create a monopoly, we need to prevent other suppliers from being in the market, and we might actually try and get existing suppliers to exit as well. So we need to get a situation where we've got to adjust ourselves in there. So we need to create barriers to entry, because if we don't have barriers to entry for these sort of other suppliers in a monopoly position, then other suppliers will enter the market and try and take our supernormal profit and keep going until there's just normal profit. So we're going to try and block these people coming in. So what are the potential barriers to entry that we have available to us? Well, I think the syllabus is going to sort of say things like licenses. So it's going to say licenses or patents. So let's say we produce a medicine in there, so a particular medicine in there, and we're given a license and a patent over that medicine, so that we can recover our costs. Let's say, and that's the reason why medicine's given licenses and patents for a certain period of time, that you can make your money back as a monopoly position, as long as you don't take too much of a Mickey take in there. So you've got that kind of thing of licenses and patents, branding, that kind of thing. There's only one Rolex, and people can't then go and create another set there. If it wasn't the case, if it was a question that anybody could sort of call themselves Rolex, well, we'd all sort of create a little Rolex factory, wouldn't we? And we'd produce more of them until supply is equal to demand. We could have our own expertise. We're the only people that can really do that. We've built our situation up that we've got the skills in there, so we've got very high-end skills. So there was, let's say we're building high-rise, big sort of tower blocks, and at the top of this tower block we've got some kind of the little thing that goes down so you can wash the windows. Now there was a company that was expert in that, those little things that go down, those things that people stand on as they go down and washing the windows. It's a very high end, very sort of expertise level of engineering, what have you. Nobody else could sort of do it, and so they had the expertise in the short term. I say short term here because if you're making supernormal profit and it's reliant upon expertise, well, expertise is often individuals, and so what can happen is that we can sort of just, there's another company hire those individuals and copy and create this product. So short expertise is a potential barrier or theoretical barrier to entry. However, long term tends to break down because people just sort of move and set up their own companies in competition. This one's more realistic here, and this is the actual one that really is used in reality, which is called market segmentation, and in the syllabus it's called cost to enter the market. That one actually is how barriers to entry are created in reality. So we've got one here which is a legal position, but it's only ever going to be given by the government for a particular period of time, and also as well so that it doesn't damage the market too much. So although there is a license, a patent for Rolex watches, there are also similarly other watches available on the market that can compete, substitute goods in there. In terms of this one, expertise never really sort of holds itself together. Over the long term, and market segmentation, cost to enter, is the one that actually is used in reality to create barriers to entry. So let's go through what market segmentation is. So we have a market, and in this world we can have two factors in there. So we can have two different types of factors for this one. Let's say it's the washing powder market, and we've got some kind of softness versus fragrance or something like that. The market is sort of set up. This is all these people in this market, and they all sort of have these different preferences between softness and fragrance, or whatever. And if another good came in that was quite close to them, they might shift towards the softness, that particular brand versus another one. Yeah. So let's say between this point and this point here, so there's a sort of a brand here. A brand here and a brand here, and so there's a sort of segment of the market between these two brands that we can have. So let's say now we set up this whole series of brands around here. This is the amount of market that we need to be able to survive to cover our costs. So we've got this amount that we need to cover our costs in here, and this monopolistic situation here, this monopoly is set up this whole series of brands here. Each of them cover the costs on there, so they're all there. So you might notice that there's Nestle's and Kellogg's in the cereals market, but there's hundreds of brands. Why have they got all these brands rather than just one big cornflakes option? Well, the reason why is that they're segmenting the market. So you've got all these different brands here, and each one of these brands can cover its costs. Now let's imagine that you want to come into this market. Is there any point where you can come in and capture sufficient market share to be able to cover your costs? Well, if I come in here, so I'm going to come in here at this point here, between these two costs here, I can take half from here, and I can take half from here, so I can have a smaller triangle in here that's half of the size, a small market share that's half this triangle here. I can't cover my costs. And so market segmentation is if there's a sort of a factor within the market that determines the market share. So let's say garage, petrol stations. Location determines the market share, the distance between petrol stations. You notice, why is there not just one great big massive petrol station? There's quite a lot of petrol stations around. Why wouldn't we just have one big one that's sort of like 4 or 5 times the size of all the other ones in there, and it's got loads of them. We just all go to that one because it's cheaper. A bigger hole to store all the petrol. There's still only just the one person. We don't need all that factor around. Why don't we have that? Well, because location's a factor in where people go to buy their petrol, along with brand as well. So what we're doing is we're segmenting the market up into sort of smaller chunks so that nobody can really sort of come in and build another petrol station. They can't create another petrol brand, what have you. So we might have to say, why do you have so many supermarkets? Well, it's about location and then brand. And the only way that we get a sort of a market, a new entrant to the market, is a bit of an error. So let's say we see in the supermarket position that Quick Save becomes a bit of a tired brand in terms of a discount retailer, and then Lidl and Aldi sort of see this gap in the market really that hasn't been covered by Tesco's and Asda, and they come in and they go into that space really. So you only really sort of get a new entrant in this world of market segmentation where the existing suppliers have made an error. So you've got this idea of market segmentation based on location. So if you ever see that situation, you could create barriers to entry, and so you'll see it, let's say, in the education market, where we have distances between colleges, and you have that distance between colleges, and people want to sort of go and learn at their college. You might see an attempt to try and enter in with online provision, but typically it's not necessarily as either well funded or as effective, and so you get that kind of idea of this market segmentation as well. And people don't then go and build another college right next to another one, or a new building right next to another one, because you can't get enough market to be able to cover it. Another example of this would be, let's say, the deregulation of the electricity generation market in the 1990s. And what would happen is that location was important for the loss of electricity across electricity wires, and you had this massive gas-fired power stations that were sort of created to try and fill up the market, so there was no ability then to come in and build another bigger super electricity supplier. Well, let's say a great big massive wind turbine kind of thing coming along or what have you in there, that sort of almost was getting prevented from that because of this idea of market segmentation. So what you always have then in the attempt to try and create this monopoly is that we create this position whereby it's impossible in this segmented market to enter and find sufficient market share based on location or based on assets or whatever it is. Now, in terms of the other one, in terms of cost to enter, is that you could create a situation whereby the potential entrant sees that it's not possible to enter the market. So I've created a position where I could switch on oversupply. So if we were into the 90s again, we would have a British plasterboard, and it could supply a huge amount of plaster and a plasterboard. And if you think, well, I can't enter this market because all that's happened is that they've got too much supply, too much cost to enter, and it's not going to be possible to achieve it. So in terms of our market segmentation, barriers to entry, we might be given it licenses. We might have expertise in the short term, not going to hold together in the long term. We might have market segmentation or cost to enter. We can't sufficiently cover our costs, so it might be really, really high in terms of the investment that we have to make, and we can't make that money back in terms of turnover. Now, in terms of this method as well, in terms of competition, you could, as a monopolistic position, a monopoly supplier, make it harder for people to come into it by increasing the amount of investment that would be made. So very high numbers of brands in there, so you have to have a huge advertising spend, lots of a lot of physical infrastructure that you need to have as well. So if you ever thought, well, cigarettes are pretty sort of similar, and the sort of cancerous sort of things that are designed to kill people, but get them addicted to. They're quite similar sort of things, really. Why on earth there's all these brands there when there's only really two suppliers in the cigarette market? Well, the reason for all those brands is to try and prevent anybody else coming into the market and being able to capture sufficient market share. So in terms of location, we'd have location, and we've got brands, and we've got investment cost to enter to try and create our barriers to entry, creating that market segmentation. Is price a barrier to entry? And so if we're really into sort of now an economics degree, and we're considering industrial economics and barriers to entry in here, I don't know on this one. I hope that the examiner's not going to say that price, we could set a lower price to discourage people from entering. It's not actually a barrier, really, because in order to reduce the price, we need to increase the supply. We might not be able to get sufficient supply in there to be able to increase for a start. It doesn't actually work. And also as well, people can see that there's not really a barrier to entry, just walking in any case. So In reality, price is never a barrier to entry. We just simply set a lower price so that people don't enter. It's nonsense, but I'm hoping that the examiner doesn't put that in as an option, because it's not really a barrier in real life. Okay, so let's see what happens in a change of the supply curve. So our supply cost is our cost of supply has increased in here. In a normal world, we're going to have a shift from this position here to this position here. Our prices are going to go up, our quantities are going to go down. If our supply curve reduces in here, we're going to move from this position here where supply is equal to demand to this position here. Price is going to go down, quantity is going to increase. That's possible on that one. If we're in a monopolistic position as well, cost of supply is increased, well, it's going to increase by even more than, it's going to be a steeper curve, so it's going to increase by even more than what would happen in a normal world. In there, prices increase, quantity reduces. So those are, just simply draw out the supply and demand curves there based upon the information that you've got, or what type of good it is and what kind of supply and demand curves that you have, and then see what happens. So if we're sort of saying you want to be, students need to be able to explain what's going to happen to prices and quantities, you draw out the supply and demand curves based upon the information that you've got in the question, the type of good, and the initial supply and demand curves, and then see what happens to the price in the graph. And if our demand curve is going to sort of change, then we've got our sort of shifts, lefts and rights in here. So in summary, the objective of this part of the syllabus is for students to understand why and how prices move. So in order to do that, you're going to understand what is the market and why is it. So what is the market and why is that the case? So what is the market? Is it monopoly, and why is that the case? Because we've got some barriers to entry. Do those barriers to entry hold or not over the long term? We want to understand what is the supply and what has changed, and what is the demand and what has changed, really. And then once we've done that and drawn out our graph, we can understand what the answer is. I hope that was helpful to you, and I hope that's sort of demystified a bit supply and demand curves for this part of the thing. So I think really what you really need to do is in those questions, highlight the bits. What is this market and why is it this market? Draw out your supply and demand curves. Then consider what has changed. So change your supply or change your demand curve in there, and then see what happens to prices and quantities sold to your answer. Hopefully that will help. As ever, if you could leave a like or a comment as well, see whether you understood this or not, or whether it needs to be changed. That's much appreciated. And also what you think about this new business awareness unit. It is quite wide ranging, and be an interesting one to see whether students can grasp the wide ranging amount of information within this particular syllabus. Thanks for listening as ever. See you in the next one. Bye bye.